Thanks very much for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to talk to you about the nocebo effect, and I'm aware of the risk. I do not want to cause one. So hopefully I don't go on too long so that it becomes painful. All right. Is there a history of the nocebo effect? And here I have to do this. And if I do that, I can see you as well. Is there a history of the nocebo effect? Well, maybe. What there really isn't is a historiography of the nocebo effect. And that is my major obstacle here. And in order to explain this obstacle, I have a few objectives in my talk today. So first, I need to provide you with some sense of what the nocebo effect is, how it works, what it does. Second, I need to front up to you about the speculative nature of this inquiry. Most of the things that I will mention today were not understood as examples of the nocebo effect, and indeed, most of them were experienced before there was any notion of such a thing as the nocebo effect. So there's a sort of array of illnesses and diseases coming your way shortly, and they were each experienced according to specific and situated diagnostic and cultural categories. I'm going to join these cases together to show their structural commonalities. And I want to underscore the point here that in doing that, I am not engaging in some fantasy of retroactive diagnosis. What I'm trying to do is supply an analytical framework for making sense of certain historical outbreaks of disease that otherwise already have their own distinct and discrete historiographical threads. So in this sense, I am making a claim that the nocebo effect is a hidden experience in two respects. First, the people who experienced it did not know that they experienced it. And on the other hand, historians have not seriously entertained the reality of illness and disease caused by the nocebo effect. So this is kind of there, but not there in those two respects. Okay, I'm elaborating here on a lacuna identified by Niels Korsvold, who was responsible for editing this collection, with respect to the placebo effect. And the placebo effect might be thought of as the obverse of nocebo, but operating essentially on the same basis. And he claims that an overwhelming focus in the history of medicine on the Hippocratic tradition has dismissed other healing options as irrational magic, while the study of magic has had little interest in the actual healing it was meant to occasion. Now, I'm identifying a similar focus in the history of disease on cases that can be defined by something concrete, bacteriological, virological contagion, or else according to some lesion-based understanding of suffering. And similarly, the study of magic has had not that much interest in the actual harm it was meant to occasion. And the third thing I need to do today, I need to explain to you why I think any of this is necessary and why it's important, and not only historiographically, but with a mind to contemporary medical politics and public health knowledge. I'm drawing on a wealth of interdisciplinary scholarship about human biocultural plasticities to do two things: to reveal the possibilities of real disease and real suffering caused by cultural and ritual encounters and dynamics. And two, I'm aiming to diminish the knee-jerk reaction to both placebo and nocebo effects as labels indicating something to do with fakery, deception, malingering, or fraud, whatever you will. And this happens both among the medical establishment and among those living with long-term effects of a nocebo transaction. My hope then is that this sort of historical revisionism can be leveraged as a tool for both better understanding and more effective treatment conditions for contemporary sufferers. So only this moderate set of ambitions in less than an hour. So I acknowledge up front I'm likely to fail here in every respect, and I want to emphasize that this is the first time I'm framing this material in quite this way, and I am circumspect, to say the least, about marshalling a wealth of research from multiple disciplines and super adding my own archival endeavors to this. And I won't be able to describe it to you in anything like granular detail. So in some ways, I'm asking you to take my word for it. And in other respects, I'm asking you to bear with me and challenge me if you want, but not too hard, while I sort of try to think through this stuff out loud. In short, I think I can probably turn that opening maybe into a yes, there is a history of the nocebo effect, but I might leave you wanting a lot more with respect to objectives 2 and 3. All right, first part. What is the nocebo effect? It's perhaps easiest to approach this through nocebo's shinier sibling, placebo. I think people will be familiar with placebo, meaning I please, as an inert medicine or other form of medical transaction that has the effect of diminishing the symptoms of the patient. The placebo effect, which is much more heavily studied across lots of academic disciplines than nocebo, is the therapeutic effect of the power of belief or expectation concerning a certain treatment administered in a certain way, in a certain setting, by a certain authority. The actual placebo, the red pill or the sugar pill or whatever it is, isn't so important or relevant as this contextual situation and its ritual processes, which have a degree of efficacy that is highly variable, though somewhat measurable. So nocebo, which therefore means I hurt or I harm, is basically the same contextual and ritual situation whereby an intrinsically harmless object causes real harm, pain, sickness, even death. Now, in the literature, there's a range of factors that have been enumerated as contributing to or causing the nocebo effect. They include individual mood disorders that are strongly connected to negative expectations, aspects of religious outlook or worldview in relation to the status and likelihood of suffering in the life course, self-examination in the context of particular exposure to disease, personal or in the media, for example, diagnostic associations, such as the emotional response to finding out you have cancer, say, sociogenic illness, the idea of a kind of contagion that works through sociocultural networks and knowledge rather than through specific pathogens. You might put things like mass hysteria under that heading. And invocation, things like magic spells, hexes, curses, stuff like that, which despite having no intrinsic power do in fact have an injurious effect on the target. Lack of trust in science or in a particular medical authority have also been identified as potentially causative. At the heart of it all, if you'll pardon the slippage, is the socioculturally situated brain in its relation to the whole body and the ways that can amplify or diminish the perception of harm, such that pain states, think of it this way, pain states actually have nothing to do with actual damage, but only with the bundling of the perception and meaning and expectation of damage, as well as with the fears, anxieties, or other emotions associated with damage. So you can think of powerful negative emotions and sensations as having the potential to feed back on the brain body in such a way as to cause the body to attack itself chemically and neurologically. This is a very condensed definition, but crucial to it. And the thing that I want to underscore and highlight and emphasize and otherwise put flashing lights around and have you not forget under any circumstances is that nocebo effects are real bodily experiences of pain and illness, which go up to and include sudden death, and that there is a body of scientific research on this phenomena to support this claim. So when someone says it's just a nocebo effect, they are implicitly denying the reality of the suffering, as well as connecting the sufferer to pathology of mind, or even worse, to a suspicion of fraud. And my contention is that even when that just is left out, both medical professionals and patients alike are skeptical of the very notion of a nocebo effect, such that you have doctors on the one hand quite likely to undertreat or even dismiss patients who present with a nocebo etiology, or else they see nocebo effects as a kind of costly and confusing noise that prevents them from attending to real disease. And on the other hand, you have patients who are likely to be insulted by a nocebo effect diagnosis because it seems as if they are being told it's all in your head, or worse, it's your fault. And this is a double load of stigma that I would like to smash to pieces, because it stands in the way of treatment and relief of potentially millions of people. Okay, that's part one. Part two. In concrete terms then, what might the nocebo effect look like or feel like? What might it include? My examples here will seem really diffuse, but it makes sense that this would be the case. After all, the placebo effect can alleviate the symptoms of many types of pain and illness, so it stands to reason that the nocebo effect manifests in a similar range of suffering. So I can draw a thread, for example, from Walter Buchanan's 1942 treatise on voodoo death and connect it backwards to studies of catastrophic shock from the American Civil War to the First World War, and forwards to contemporary studies of sudden death and nocebo science. And it might look, when I do this, like I'm grouping disparate things under one head, but I think that the intellectual history of these topics substantiates the grouping. So Walter Buchanan had designed a serious experimental investigation into the possibility that apparently innocuous activity, like a curse or a magic spell, could cause death. He asked, could an ominous and persistent state of fear end the life of a man? This took place in a context where scientists and clinicians, including Cannon, had for years struggled to understand the phenomenon of shock, the sudden and irreversible disintegration of human regulatory functions, such that a sight, sound, or otherwise innocuous injury might cause some people, but not all, to die. The unfolding of this mystery during and after the First World War has been forensically documented by Todd Myers and Stephanos Geroulanos, and I recommend this book to you wholeheartedly. They capture the consternation of medical scientists that the human machine turned out to be not very predictable. So the same injuries in similar patients under similar circumstances led to drastically different outcomes. And what's most striking is the astonishing constellation of disciplinary expertise that was rolled out to try to meet this challenge of why different things happen to different people. So you have psychiatrists, physiologists, anthropologists, all endeavoring to prove that their discipline had the tools to crack the puzzle of catastrophic shock. But it's only in their interweaving that we find the really interesting stuff. So Cannon was inspired by the anthropologists, and in turn, the anthropologists were inspired by Cannon. So anthropology, physiology kind of crossing over. Voodoo death was a means of accessing the contextual and individual vagaries of shock. It showed the power of magic and provided an explanatory framework for why not all human systems always behave the same way, despite their obvious functional similarities. It opened the door to the imprint of culture and society upon the body, upon the balance between life and death, and in turn, it paved the way for nocebo studies. For medical scientists, it pointed the way to an understanding of the brain body's capacity to produce pain and to cause death as if from nowhere. As a consequence of sorcery, Cannon wrote, a person may die from a true state of shock in the surgical sense, a shock induced by prolonged and tense emotion. On the battlefield, a shocking experience could have persistent effects such that anxiety, coupled with insufficient food and water and rapid pulse, was sufficient to kill. He said it would fit well with the conditions reported from primitive tribes, his language. Voodoo death may be real, and it may be explained as due to shocking emotional distress, to obvious or repressed terror. Now, since this article, middle of last century, many have adopted it, lots of people have critiqued it. But most scientists of placebo and nocebo agree that words and ritual practices do have the power to cause pain and even to give rise to dangerous emotions that can kill in certain circumstances and certain contexts where the emotional physiological response to them is predicated on the reality of their power. So this can include feelings of just simply being helpless or hopeless. So in a revised form, voodoo death remains a reference point to contemporary medical science. So Martin Samuels here, founding chair of neurology at the Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School, revisited Cannon's voodoo death in a 2007 article, demonstrating through the autonomic nervous system the connection between neuropsychiatric illness and the visceral organs, which could explain all manner of unexpected deaths. So he connected, here's a shopping list or laundry list of sudden death. Sudden death in middle-aged men, sudden infant death syndrome, voodoo death or being scared to death, sudden death during a natural catastrophe, sudden death caused by grief or a major loss, sudden death in a panic attack or from mental stress, sudden death during war, and a bunch of other sudden deaths. I lumped them all together. And I think it's of profound importance to medical science, to historians, to society at large, that there's a wealth of experimental evidence that, in his words, stress alone can result in the production of cardiac lesions that lead to death. And to avoid any confusion here, the definition of stress here is quite broad. In his definition, restraint, surgery, bacteremia, vagotomy, toxins, and others. The neurologic catastrophe, Samuels writes, is caused by the overactivity of the sympathetic limb of the autonomic nervous system, causing major cardiac and pulmonary pathologies. In certain conditions, the heart literally breaks. Fear, it seems, is sufficient to break it. Belief in the power of a curse, especially if it's reinforced in the collective, might result in the most extreme nocebo effects, severe pain, even death. So for the anthropologists, voodoo death gave them a situated understanding of the potential reality of magical beliefs and practices, which justified a tight focus on cultural symbols, ritual practices, and so on as having biological power. And we have inherited that in history also. This entanglement of the intellectual history of physiological and psychological and anthropological research on the reality of the nocebo effect has given the idea to some historians and given them the scope to entertain the historical reality of witchcraft in the past, even if those cases were in the minority, in the sort of high or low points, whichever way you look at it, of the witch hunting crazes in Europe and elsewhere. Still, if I just take this thread, I think it's suggestive enough of a massive scope for some kind of historiographical intervention with respect to nocebo effect. But there's a lot more. What else might it include? My own entry point to this field was the study of mass hysteria. In the mid-1970s, François Syrah did an historical survey of epidemic hysteria between 1872 and 1972 and found that there were large-scale outbreaks that were quite common, taking place in schools and towns and factories, and involving potentially hundreds of people at a time. This is one of the key themes. Syrah traces the earliest reports of mass hysteria back to 1374 with the dancing manias of Aachen. But it's easy to go farther back and farther afield. Christopher Milne's recent history of euphoria traced the connections between pain, hysteria, compulsive mass dancing, and St. Vitus dance, finding an explanation of frenzied dancing souls in Aristotle, and a story of a bridge that collapsed under the weight of 200 compulsive dancers in Germany in 1278. Then we have the history of Tarantism in Italy, which dates to at least the 11th century, but which maintained a centuries-long peak in the early modern period. So the cure for Tarantism, which is having been bitten by tarantula, was the Tarantismo, which was a sort of dancing ritual to cure symptoms which included nausea, paralysis, lethargy, spasms, headaches, irregular pulse, and breathing and fainting. And the problem is that hardly anyone actually had been bitten by a spider. The evidence of spider bite was usually wanting. So I was engaging with all of that stuff initially to try to make sense of an outbreak of mass hysterical tetanus on a 19th century emigrant ship bound for Australia from England, interweaving situated medical knowledge about nymphomania and sexual immorality in women and a received popular knowledge of the medical recognizability of the arc en cercle as a classical presentation of both tetanus and hysteria. They are side by side. So what I found really curious about this was that hysterical muscular contractions that look like the bottom picture here remain common only until the identification of the true etiology of tetanus, after which point the arc en cercle went, as it were, out of fashion, very possibly because psychiatrists stopped suggesting it to their patients. But my argument then and now is that the physical expression of illness like this, it wasn't chicanery and it wasn't a conscious performance, and it wasn't reducible to the suggestion of medical authorities, but it was an available expression for real suffering. And it had been contagious. That ship was full of women trapped on board falling into hysterical arches. Call it emotional transmission if you like. You could call it empathy after a certain definition. The original formulation of empathy was the unconscious repetition of movement. Since I was doing that work on the emigrant ship, I found the minor note in John Haygarth's Of the Imagination as a Cause and as a Cure of Disorders of the Body from 1800. And the clue is right there in the title. But the fame of this treatise is really in it being a progenitor of like the placebo-controlled trial. So Haygarth was looking at Perkins' tractors, which are here satirized by Gilray in 1801, and doing controlled testing on a medical appliance. And I'm interested in that, of course, but what I want to focus on is Haygarth's theorization of the nocebo effect, though he didn't call it that. How does a disease of the imagination cause disorders of the body? Specifically, Haygarth examined the phenomenon of epidemical convulsions. And his premise was that when an illness made an unfavorable impression, then others would follow it by imitation, sympathy, or some other affection of the imagination, which is not generally known. To exemplify the point, he turned to an outbreak of disease, which had been described to him by a correspondent as a new malady in Anglesey in North Wales. His correspondent described the progress of this new disease. It began with a pain in the head, sometimes the stomach and the side, and this was followed by an alarming catching or convulsion in the upper extremity resembling St. Vitus' dance. Patients did not seem to be in mortal danger, but this great agitation of body continued with little intermission, causing the shoulders almost to meet by the exertion. Now, this local physician gathered together 10 cases, and he bled them, as was customary, and remarked as follows: "It appears to me extraordinary that the disorder is confined to this neighborhood alone and only affects females from 10 to 25 years old." And he wondered in good Hippocratic style whether it weren't an effect of the local climate. And Haygarth disabused him of that notion. He had direct experience of the communication of nervous disorders like the contagiousness of yawning, and he had seen hysteric fits spread frequently in hospitals, to the point that he ordered the exclusion of all convulsive disorders from women's wards in the Chester Infirmary. He recommended keeping all the afflicted in Anglesey apart from each other to stop the epidemic spreading to the whole island. In the end, there were 24 cases, all connected, all but one case for women. All were cured by isolation and the administration of benign essential oils. Haygarth then spreads his analysis. "It is universally known," he wrote. Note, it wasn't. "It is universally known that convulsive disorders are communicated to persons who live in the same house or apartment. From there, house-to-house spread was known through intimate intercourse, seeing the distressing convulsions, hearing the alarming shrieks, and through listening to accounts of sufferings feelingly and frightfully described." He collected incidents of this kind of epidemic throughout Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries and ascribes them ultimately to affection of the imagination. And here, this section of Haygarth's work joins up again with the preceding one on the placebo tractors. For this was a case of the influence of the passions upon disorders of the body. He describes the siege of Breda in 1625, where the garrison suffered an epidemic of scurvy that was miraculously cured by wonder-working balsams that had no intrinsic medicinal value. If the imagination, under the influence of hope and faith, could cure, it stood to reason that the imagination, under the influence of fear and distress, could cause disease. And though Haygarth didn't know about it at the time, or at least I don't think so, Ben Franklin had reached the same conclusions in his inquiry into mesmerism for Louis XVI of France in 1785. "History," Franklin wrote, "has transmitted to us a great number of cures operated by fear, by joy, or the commotion of any violent passion. The convulsions, contractions, and other symptoms caused by animal magnetism under the hands of Mesmer were just as easily construed as disease as they were therapy. Just depends how you look at it." And the same was true, you can't make this out, but there's a lot of people here falling into a terrible state. This is a depiction of the Jansenist convulsionnaire in Paris in the 1730s. an outbreak of convulsions and seizures that fell somewhere between the miraculous, the perverse, and the pathologically hysterical in what B. Robert Kreisler called a mental universe of religious themes of death, divine wrath, martyrdom, judgment, and the end of days. Sounds like now. The takeaway here is that symptoms change according to cultural and epistemological scripts concerning presentation and experience, making specific contextual factors vital for an understanding of the specific characteristics of what I'm calling nocebo onset diseases in each theater of their emergence. And can take another example. The iatrogenic effect of medical anxiety about modernity, starting in the late 19th century, the spread and particular presentations of neurasthenia being the subject here. So the argument in this book, for example, is that doctors provided a popular script about the ways in which modernity, electricity, and technology might overtax the human physiological system. And it was only a matter of time until overtaxed humans started presenting themselves precisely as symptomatic of neurasthenia caused by modern life. And the point is, they weren't faking it. I think then that I can justify employing the nocebo effect as an analytical category to group together all these disparate diseases, from hysterical tetanus and epilepsy to compulsive dancing to railway spine to neurasthenia, what you will. Diseases of the imagination are today rarely put under the category of mass hysteria or choreomania or the like, but that doesn't mean that they've gone away. There have been various attempts to relabel such phenomena, in part to shift the negative connotations of the word hysteria and replace it with something more sensitive to the lived experience of real distress and illness. So Western medicine has cannily appropriated the Greek word for injury, trauma, and made trauma into an affliction of the mind with all kinds of attendant bodily effects. Our concepts of trauma, depression, PTSD, various other syndromes, things like chronic fatigue syndrome or ME, all potentially, but not always, connect with the phenomena described by Haygarth in 1800. The diagnostic categories and the shifting political authority of medicine do something to the experience of this kind of disease, but I want to alert to their potential structural similarities and try to enfold them together in a general approach to the power of nocebo effects, especially when it takes place on a social level. And I will exemplify this through a case close to our own times. If you haven't seen this, I view a caution. It's somewhat contagious just to watch it. Dangerous viewing, I would say. So Leroy, New York was put on the map in 2011 after an outbreak of Tourette's among mainly teenage girls. The outbreak was famously captured in the documentary, The Town That Caught Tourette's, 2012, in which the involuntary twitching and vocalizing of these afflicted young women, as well as their struggles with the medical system, were really painfully exhibited. The end for all except one confirmed diagnosis of Tourette's was the dissolution of the narrative in a diagnosis of conversion disorder, combined with mass psychogenic illness. And this was received, on the whole, in a storm of protests by the patient's parents as a charge that the girls were faking it, which is quite the opposite of what the diagnosis was meant to convey. So here, really tangibly, the stigma associated with the nocebo effect is in evidence. And what's more, if you start to dig around in the science of conversion disorder or mass psychogenic illness, you find a lot of uncertainty, vague gesturing at bits of the brain, conjuring with stress, without a clear definition of what stress is, and so on. These things are essentially modern updates of hysteria, struggling against the same kinds of forces that made hysteria synonymous with fakery and with feminine weakness or deficiency. In a 2012 article in the New York Times Magazine, there was speculation about how one person's illness could be reflected in another person's neural pathways, resulting in a generalization about mirror neurons and psychogenic illnesses like these being transmitted via, quote, a maladaptive version of the kind of empathy that finds expression in actual physical sensation, such as yawning or sympathetic nausea, harking unwittingly all the way back to Haygarth in 1800. In the intervening decade, mirror neurons have gone off the boil somewhat, but still the idea of mimicry abides, and we find similar puzzling cases that scientists haven't cracked in outbreaks of so-called resignation syndrome among migrant children. Skimming off the surface of all of these things. But it does bring us kind of up to the present, and this is where I will break to the third part of this talk, which is about contemporary medical politics and an urgent public health concern. So my case here is about long COVID. Correspondent to the Journal of Public Health in August 2021, so fairly early on, noted the high degree of probability that the pandemic could cause large-scale nocebo events, given the amount of negative information flowing through information channels over which there was no editorial or expert controls, and an environmental context that emphasized the powerlessness of citizens in the face of a high risk of contagion, or at least the perception of such. Ultimately, this correspondent pointed to the importance of politics in public health, since on-target messaging, clear communication, and the kind of medical authority that exudes expertise, he said, are essential for governments who hope to safeguard public health, not only from a specific viral pathogen, but also from the nocebo effect that is activated through negativity, lack of clarity, inconsistent policy, and a tendency to ignore medical expertise in favor of glib ideologies or perceived political expediency. Now, in my view at least, the pandemic seemed to turn out to be exemplary of a lack of clarity, inconsistent policy, a tendency to ignore medical expertise in favor of glib ideologies or perceived political expediency. And if you agree with me in that, in whatever theater you happen to be residing in at the time, then I think we need to pay attention to possibilities here. A 2021 study, this was one of the earliest studies, found that people who strongly believed themselves to be infected with COVID-19 were more likely to experience severe symptoms indicative of COVID-19, especially if those people had a history of anxiety. And this confirmed other studies that found the prevalence of negative emotions to correlate with the reporting of symptoms of illness and of treatment side effects. Then there was a study in Greece on patients with autoimmune rheumatic diseases that found 10% of respondents, highly correlated with a higher level of education, experiencing new nocebo effects related to their disease, representing an increase in nocebo behavior compared with before the pandemic. And the speculation here is that the pandemic's association with emotional distress and significant disruptions in healthcare services were causing these new nocebo effects. The atmosphere of COVID-19 is presumed to have generated symptoms even unrelated to COVID-19, which points to the causative power of higher rates of health anxiety and emotional stress about the status of medicine and health provision. When I was writing this book, and it only came out a few months ago, I wrote about the enormous scope for nocebo studies in relation to so-called long COVID patients. And as I was kind of updating this for this talk, I'm like, oh, this is already happening, and it's happening with speed. I had expected that some proportion of long COVID suffering had to do with nocebo effects correlated with the emotional atmosphere and with individual histories of emotion disorder. When I was writing that book, preliminary research from 2021 showed that half of the patients studied who were seeking medical help for post-acute COVID-19 syndrome, 50% of long COVID presentations, had not actually had COVID. That was at a time when it was possible, when not everybody had had it already. So we won't get further confirmation of this, but it's kind of an alarming study. But regardless of whether they'd had COVID or not, they found that the symptoms of long COVID were always characterized by severe fatigue, altered quality of life, and psychological distress. The study did find that a significant proportion of the cohort reporting long COVID had a positive screening for anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Again, all temptations at dismissing these symptoms or long COVID itself as merely the social contagion of malingering or an elaborate hoax have to be dismissed. As the authors here assert, the persistence of physical symptoms related or not to COVID-19 is likely associated with the psychological burden of the pandemic. In other words, an infection with COVID-19 is not a necessary precondition for some presentations of long COVID. A massive proportion of society might begin undergoing a nocebo effect akin to PTSD. Now, a paper from last August in Sage Open Medicine directly engaged this problem, renaming long COVID pandemic response syndrome and demanding a slew of new research to sort out what are quite likely a number of very different conditions under one diagnostic category. And bear in mind, this was a lived experience driven diagnostic category in the first place. The authors make two arguments that many people find difficult to reconcile. One is that long COVID symptoms are genuinely experienced, persistent physical symptoms that are usually functional in nature and therefore potentially reversible. And two is that long COVID is compatible with the notion of mass sociogenic functional illness and the concept of nocebo effects. And when this paper came out, I was surprised neither by the analysis nor by the response of the public. This is a snapshot of it. Basically, people suffering with long COVID or who otherwise had some kind of experience treating or living with long COVID immediately vented anger, horror, disgust at the very notion that this condition might be imaginary or in some way in the mind, pointing instead to the political agenda of the authors whose anti-lockdown stance identified them with so-called COVIDiots. Remember them? So there is some wheat and chaff sorting required in the scientific literature. But the knee-jerk response against any indication that the nocebo effect is involved is entirely in keeping with the stigma and misunderstanding surrounding what Haygoth called diseases of the imagination, from classical hysteria to reactive psychological disaster syndrome, and is, as other authors have attested, quickly dovetailing with the CFS and ME advocacy, where the biopsychosocial approach to the disease is routinely rejected as gaslighting patients. So while many will reject the notion that long COVID has nothing necessarily to do with COVID-19 virus itself, but is rather based in the atmosphere of fear and anxiety and stress on a massive social scale, it seems imperative, at least to me, that a more widespread acceptance and understanding of nocebo effects as real bodily illness is one necessary condition for therapy palliation. There is a ton to unpack, especially since long COVID is almost certainly more than one thing, maybe many things. One study found, for example, that there was no direct correlation between a diagnosis of COVID-19 and a nocebo effect leading to long COVID, and gestured vaguely at other mechanisms. But these kinds of cohort studies are replete with wildly uncontrolled variables. In a recent book on research efforts to translate mechanistic research on placebo and nocebo effects into adequate strategies for better symptom management and treatment, Leonard Calabresi asserts that long COVID will likely become the greatest public health problem in the foreseeable future, as well as the greatest opportunity and challenge for the field of placebo and nocebo science. Here too, the forecast is that long COVID is caused by numerous mechanisms, frequently confounded by neuropsychological amplifiers with resultant nocebo effects. But crucially, Calabresi points to the potential benefits of a controlled harnessing of the placebo effect in the clinical encounter, echoing work he previously carried out with Loana Koloka, and which Koloka continues to promote, while outlining the cutting edge of nocebo science and the necessity for further research. As a practical application of this, a 2022 study on the effect of different communication strategies on the shaping of illness expectations found that a simple change in language from long COVID to ongoing COVID-19 recovery led to much more positive expectations of illness outcomes, especially when bundled with information about where to find support. So explicitly then, literally, hope and optimism are being mobilized as a serious consideration in the future management and mitigation of long COVID. So I conclude, therefore, with a reprise of my opening purpose, which was to establish that while there's no obvious historiography of the nocebo effect, there is a history of it that needs to be written, though the evidence for it is diffuse, scattered across time and place, and under a multitude of historically situated forms and experience. And crucially, that this history has a potential use. So I'm known for banging a drum about the value of historical knowledge production and what it can do in other fields. And here I think the potential is clear. In our own midst, long COVID is a political football, one of the worst. And the cost of the politics of that diagnostic category, I think, is actually borne by those people suffering with it. It's obviously essential that the biocultural scientific research continues on many fronts, but I want to submit to you that an historical view allows for some important perspective taking, not least in establishing for the medical community and the public alike that nocebo effects are real, they're directly and bodily experienced, they're not anything to do with fraud or malingering or mental weakness, they're not the patient's fault, crucially, they're treatable. That's it. Thank you. Plugs.
Thanks so much, Rob. That was a really fascinating and rich presentation.